The wind does not merely blow across the North Atlantic in winter. It hunts, it scours the land with ice and salt. It presses snow sideways into every crack and hollow, and on nights when the clouds hang low and the darkness stretches unbroken for months, the world feels less like a place made for human life, and more like a test meant to strip the unprepared of warmth, strength, and breath. And it was into this world that Viking settlers arrived, stepping onto volcanic shores where the earth itself seemed unfinished, raw, treeless, and unforgiving, a land where winter did not announce itself politely, but descended like a weight, sealing the horizon, and turning survival into a daily calculation, measured in fire, shelter, and endurance. They came from Scandinavia carrying memories of tall timber halls, of oak beams and pine rafters rising proudly above frozen ground, buildings that stood tall against snow and wind. But when they reached Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, they found that the forests they depended on simply did not exist, that the familiar materials of home were absent, and that every mistake here would be paid for, not in discomfort but in death. Because in a North Atlantic winter there is no margin for error, no gentle learning curve, only cold that seeps inward and darkness that erodes resolve. So the question facing the Vikings was not how to build comfortably, but how to build at all, how to create warmth where there was none, how to anchor life in a landscape that offered little more than grass, stone, wind, and frozen soil. And the answer they discovered would shape their survival for centuries. An answer that required them to stop fighting the land and instead sink into it, quite literally turning the earth itself into shelter and allowing their homes to disappear into the hills like quiet secrets waiting out the storm. This is the story of how Vikings built underground turf houses to survive brutal winters, not through grand monuments or towering walls, but through patience, observation, and a deep understanding of how cold behaves, how heat lingers, and how the ground beneath one's feet can become the difference between life and death. When the first Norse settlers arrived in Iceland in the late 9th century, they were experienced builders, men and women who knew how to raise long houses from timber frames, who understood load-bearing walls and steep roofs designed to shed snow. But experience alone could not conjure forests where none existed. And Iceland offered them a harsh lesson almost immediately, because beyond small, twisted patches of birch scrub, clinging stubbornly to sheltered valleys, the island was nearly bare, stripped of the tall trees that defined Scandinavian architecture and identity. Archaeological evidence confirms what those settlers quickly realized through necessity rather than theory, that usable timber was scarce to the point of crisis, that cutting the limited birch would only accelerate erosion and ruin the fragile soil, and that the kind of wood needed to build full wooden halls simply did not grow here, meaning that the traditional Viking house, proud and elevated, was no longer an option, not if families hoped to survive more than a single winter. Yet beneath their boots, under the thin carpet of grass that covered the volcanic ground, lay something unexpected. Thick layers of compacted peat and sod, centuries of decomposed plant matter pressed together by time, moisture, and weight, forming a dense, fibrous material that could be cut into blocks, lifted by hand and stacked with care. And while it did not look impressive, while it lacked the visual authority of timber or stone, it possessed a quality far more valuable in this climate, an extraordinary ability to trap heat. Peat, unlike wood, is riddled with tiny air pockets formed by decayed vegetation, and these pockets act as natural insulation, slowing the movement of heat so effectively that a wall of turf 1 meter thick could outperform even the most carefully fitted wooden planks. And the Vikings, practical to the core, recognized this not as a compromise but as an advantage, a gift offered quietly by the land itself. So they began to cut the earth, slicing rectangular blocks of sod from the hillsides, each piece heavy with moisture and life, grass still growing on top, roots tangled through the soil beneath. And these blocks were stacked carefully in interlocking patterns, angled inward so that gravity pressed them together rather than forcing them apart, creating walls that were not rigid but resilient, flexible enough to settle without collapsing, thick enough to resist the cold, and alive enough that, come summer, flowers would bloom directly from the roof. From a distance, these early turf houses did not look like buildings at all, but like low, grassy mounds shaped gently by the landscape. Their entrances small and dark, their presence subtle, as if the settlers had chosen not to impose themselves on the land but to hide within it, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. And yet turf alone could not solve every problem, because while earth could hold warmth, something still had to hold the roof, something still had to frame doorways and support beams, and in a land without forests, even a single piece of wood became priceless, forcing the Vikings to look not to the hills, but to the sea itself. With forests absent and every beam suddenly precious, the Vikings turned their attention outward, toward the sea that both threatened and sustained them, because the North Atlantic, violent and unpredictable as it was, carried within it a quiet generosity, one that revealed itself only to those patient enough to wait along the shore after storms had passed. Far to the east and north, immense rivers flowed through Siberian forests, tearing trees from their banks during spring floods, sending trunks and branches drifting northward into Arctic waters, where ice locked them in place and carried them slowly, relentlessly, across the top of the world, sometimes for years, until warmer currents loosened their grip and released these wandering timbers onto distant shores, including the black beaches of Iceland and the rocky coasts of Greenland. This driftwood was not merely useful, it was vital, so valuable that laws quickly formed around it, granting coastal farmers legal ownership over whatever wood washed up on their land. And when a good log appeared, men would haul it inland with the same care normally reserved for livestock or food, drying it slowly, splitting it only when absolutely necessary, and planning its use long before a blade ever touched the grain. No piece of wood was wasted, not a splinter, because unlike turf, which could be cut again and again from the land, timber could not be replaced, and this scarcity reshaped Viking building practices entirely, forcing them to abandon excess and focus only on what was structurally essential, creating frames that were minimal yet effective, skeletal but strong, designed to hold roofs rather than walls, because the earth itself would bear the rest. Archaeological excavations of early Norse turf houses reveal this careful economy in every post and beam, showing large unsplit logs used where possible in early years, followed by increasingly refined techniques as supplies dwindled. Logs split lengthwise to create two beams from one, reused timbers pulled from abandoned halls, even imported wood brought at great cost from Norway, all of it recycled, reshaped, and passed down like inheritance, because in a world built from grass and soil, wood stood alone as the rarest substance of all. The construction of a turf house followed a rhythm dictated by labor, weather, and the slow gathering of materials, beginning with the choice of site, often a gentle slope that would allow rain and meltwater to drain away naturally, because water, more than cold, was the true enemy, capable of rotting turf, weakening walls, and turning warmth into damp misery if not carefully controlled. Builders leveled the ground and laid a foundation of flat stones, not for grandeur but for survival, lifting the turf walls away from wet soil and distributing the immense weight of the structure. Because a fully built turf house could weigh tens of tons, an earthen mass pressing steadily downward, requiring a base that would not shift with frost or thaw. Only after this stone footing was in place did the wooden frame rise, vertical posts set carefully into stone pads, crossbeams connecting them, and a single ridge pole running the length of the house like a spine, forming just enough structure to support the roof, nothing more, nothing wasted, because every unnecessary beam represented warmth lost somewhere else. Then came the slow work of stacking turf, block by block, layer by layer, each sod placed with intention, angled inward so that gravity locked the wall together rather than pulling it apart, the thickness growing as the walls rose, sometimes reaching nearly 2 meters at the base, a living barrier that absorbed wind, muffled sound, and quietly began to trap heat long before a fire was ever lit inside. The roof followed the same logic, rafters laid across the ridgepole, then buried beneath successive layers of sod until the house disappeared entirely beneath grass and earth, becoming less a building and more a reshaped hill, one that welcomed snow as an ally rather than an enemy, because every snowfall added insulation, every drift sealing warmth inside like a blanket pulled tighter against the cold. From above, nothing betrayed human presence except a narrow doorway and, in winter, the faint thread of smoke rising from a small opening in the roof, barely visible against the dark sky. And inside that mound of earth something remarkable began to happen, as fire met soil, as heat met mass, and a fragile pocket of warmth slowly formed, held steady not by force but by patience and design. Once the walls had risen, and the roof had settled into the hillside, the turf house revealed its true purpose not from the outside but from within, because its genius was never meant to be admired, only felt, slowly, over long nights when the wind clawed at the land, and the cold pressed inward from every direction except the one that mattered most, the ground itself. Inside, the space was long and narrow, low-ceilinged and dim, the walls thick enough that daylight entered reluctantly through the doorway, and a small opening in the roof, and at the very centre of this enclosed world lay the hearth, a shallow pit, lined with stones, and filled with burning peat or driftwood. Not a fireplace in the modern sense, but a living source of heat that demanded constant attention, because to let it die was to invite the cold back in. There was no chimney rising proudly into the sky, no clear channel for smoke to escape, only a modest vent in the roof, just wide enough to allow smoke to seep out slowly, while trapping as much warmth as possible. And on still days the air inside could grow thick and acrid, stinging eyes, blackening beams, coating walls with soot. Yet no one complained, because smoke was a small price to pay for survival, and clean air meant little if fingers froze and breath turned shallow. The fire radiated heat outward in all directions, warming the packed earth floor, the turf walls, and the heavy air itself. And this was where the true physics of the turf house took hold, because unlike wood, which sheds heat quickly, turf absorbed it slowly, drinking it in, holding it within its dense, fibrous mass, and then releasing it back into the space over hours, long after the flames had softened into glowing embers. The house became a thermal vessel, a quiet battery charged by fire and bodies alike, storing warmth during the day and releasing it through the night, smoothing out the brutal swings of the Arctic climate, so that while outside the temperature plunged far below freezing, and the winds screamed across the plain, inside the air could remain surprisingly mild, sometimes warm enough that heavy outer garments were shed and hands could move freely again. Every detail of daily life reinforced this fragile balance, because heat was precious and wasteful movement meant loss. So along the walls low benches were built from wood or stone, wide enough to sit on by day and sleep on by night, forcing bodies to cluster together near the hearth, not out of sentiment but efficiency, because shared warmth was warmth multiplied, and distance from the fire was a luxury no one could afford. Families slept side by side beneath hides and woven mats, breath rising in slow clouds that mingled with smoke and steam from cooking, adding to the invisible warmth trapped beneath the sod roof, while children learned early to tend the fire, to read its needs, to know when to feed it and when to let it rest. Because fire was not decoration here, it was life itself, a fragile line separating warmth from silence. Some houses extended outward, small attached rooms branching from the main hall, spaces for storage or animals, and in the coldest months livestock might be kept just beyond a partition wall, their body heat seeping into the living space, an arrangement that modern sensibilities might recoil from, but which made perfect sense to people who understood that survival was a system, not a matter of comfort or cleanliness. Even the floor played its role, often sunk below ground level, placing the living space closer to the earth's stable temperature, shielded from wind and frost, because beneath the surface the land remains relatively constant year-round, neither fully frozen nor fully warm, and by anchoring the house into this zone, the Vikings reduced heat loss in ways they may not have described mathematically, but understood intimately through experience. Snow, too, became an ally rather than an enemy, piling against the turf walls and roof, sealing gaps, adding another insulating layer, so that storms which would have destroyed wooden buildings instead reinforced the earthen shell, pressing it tighter against the warmth inside, turning the house into a quiet refuge hidden beneath white drifts and darkness. And within this enclosed world, as the fire crackled softly and the walls radiated stored heat back into tired bodies, something deeper than engineering took shape. Because the turf house did not merely shelter people from winter, it reorganized how they lived, how they slept, how they spoke, and how they endured the long, lightless months together, bound by necessity, proximity, and the steady pulse of a fire that could never be allowed to fade. When the longhouse was finally finished and the heavy roof of turf settled into its slope, the true test began, not in the cutting of sod or the laying of stones, but in the keeping of warmth. For in the far north, shelter is not a structure. It is a living thing that must breathe, exhale, and remember heat the way a body remembers comfort after pain. Inside the low, earthen rooms, the air hung thick and dark, walls muffled every sound from the outside world, and only a single flicker of fire reminded the family that the sun still existed somewhere beyond the clouds and snow. The hearth lay at the center of everything, both physically and spiritually. It was a shallow pit lined with stone, filled not with logs, for there were none to spare, but with blocks of dried peat, cut from the marshes in summer, and now smouldering slowly through the endless night. There was no chimney, no tall stone column guiding smoke upward into the sky. Instead, a narrow vent in the roof, no wider than a man's hand, allowed the smoke to drift out reluctantly, curling and clinging before finding its way into the storm outside. On windless days, the smoke hung inside the hall like a ghost, veiling faces in grey mist, stinging the eyes, blackening the beams, leaving a taste of earth and ash on every breath. And yet, they did not curse it. Smoke was not a nuisance. It was proof of life. Without it, there was nothing but cold and silence. The fire burned low, but it burned constantly, a small heart beating in the middle of the dark. Its warmth seeped into the sod walls, into the packed earth beneath their feet, into the benches of wood and stone that lined the hall. The heat was not quick or bright. It was slow, patient, deep. Turf absorbed it like a sponge, storing it through the day, and giving it back through the night. In time, even the walls themselves seemed to breathe, a faint, steady warmth radiating from every side, as if the house remembered every spark that had ever touched its core. Here, in this dim refuge, families lived pressed close to one another, their daily rhythm shaped entirely by the fire. The benches that lined the walls served as both seats and beds. By day they worked there, mending nets, spinning wool, carving tools. By night they slept there, side by side beneath thick hides and woven blankets, the youngest closest to the hearth, the elders furthest away but still within reach of its glow. Each movement was quiet, deliberate, born of habit and necessity, for too much noise, too much stirring, meant letting in the cold. Outside, the wind shrieked across the plains, erasing footprints, snapping the ice off cliffs, driving snow sideways until the world became a blur of white. But inside the turf house the sound was reduced to a dull hum, a distant ocean beating endlessly against the walls of earth. The sod muted everything. Even time itself seemed to move more slowly. Sometimes animals were kept close, beyond a partition or behind a rough wall of turf, sheep, goats, or a cow, breathing warmth into the shared air. It was a practical arrangement, not born of affection but of survival, because in this kind of cold, every living thing that exhaled heat became part of the household. The line between home and stable blurred, between human and animal life narrowed, and all were folded into one small fragile ecosystem sustained by fire. And then there was the floor, lower than the surrounding ground, cut deep into the earth where the temperature remained constant even when the air outside froze solid. The Vikings understood this, even if they could not name the science behind it. The ground itself became part of the home's body, a vast, steady reservoir of warmth that never faltered completely. When storms screamed across the plains, the turf house seemed to vanish under snow, and yet inside, light still flickered on the walls, and the air remained thick with the scent of peat, smoke, and life. The turf house did not defy winter. It accepted it, folded it inward, turned the brutality of the season into insulation, and transformed the very thing that sought to kill them into a quiet ally. And as the fire whispered through the night, the people inside learned that survival in such a place required more than strength. It demanded silence, endurance, and a deep humility before the earth itself. Daylight in those northern winters was a rumor, a faint silver glow that slipped briefly across the horizon before vanishing again, leaving the world in its long and endless night. Inside the turf houses, time ceased to matter in any ordinary sense. The sun was no longer a measure of the day, only the fire was. When its light dimmed, when its coals sank low, they stirred and fed it. When it burned bright, they cooked, mended, spoke in murmurs. It was the pulse by which their lives were kept. The hall was both shelter and world. Everything that needed doing, cooking, weaving, carving, sleeping, praying, took place within those thick earthen walls. The smell of peat smoke mixed with wool grease, with boiled milk, with drying fish, with the faint sourness of damp boots lined up by the doorway. It was a world of texture and scent more than sight, a living memory of the land itself distilled into human space. Meals were small but filling, a stew of barley, a few pieces of dried meat, softened in hot water, the occasional fish brought in from the frozen coast. Every bite came with effort. Wood for boiling water was precious, so cooking happened slowly, with care. The peat fire was coaxed rather than stoked, its embers rearranged with iron tongs that had been passed down for generations, each one blackened smooth by countless winters. At night, the hall changed character. The noise of labor faded into the rhythm of breathing. Families huddled close together on the benches, their silhouettes half lit by the orange glow of the fire. The walls breathed warmth back into them, the low roof trapped their shared body heat, and the air, though heavy with smoke, felt intimate, alive, protective. Outside, the wind tore at the land, screaming like an animal. But within there was stillness, the stillness of endurance. Children listened to stories whispered by their elders, tales of the old world across the sea, of heroes and gods, of Odin's wandering, of Thor's hammer echoing through the clouds, of long ships that once cut through calmer waters. In the flicker of the flames their imaginations saw those distant lands, forests that no longer existed here, halls of wood and gold, summers that stretched longer than a heartbeat. The sagas became more than stories. They were memories of warmth in a place that had forgotten the sun. In these houses, people learned the art of patience. Winter could last 7 months or more. Storms would isolate them completely, sealing doorways with snow, forcing families to dig tunnels out to the light. And yet, they rarely despaired. They spun wool by dim firelight, mended nets for fishing, carved small figures from driftwood to pass the time. The rhythm of survival had its own quiet grace. Sometimes the silence itself became a companion. When the wind dropped and the fire burned steady, you could hear the faint crack of ice forming outside, the muted breathing of animals in the adjoining stall, the slow settling of the roof as snow packed itself tighter. The whole structure seemed to exhale, as though the earth itself were alive, holding its children close beneath its heavy frozen skin. The Vikings did not build these homes to challenge nature. They built them to live within it, to share its moods. Their houses blurred the boundary between architecture and landscape, between the human and the elemental. The walls were not separate from the hill. They were the hill. The roof was not a cover but a continuation of the meadow above. To step outside was not to leave the house, but to climb out of the earth's embrace. And when dawn finally returned, faint, pale, uncertain, it filtered through the vent above the hearth and laid a single thread of light across the smoke-blackened beams. It touched the faces of those still sleeping, curled beneath wool and fur, and shimmered softly on the slow spirals of smoke still rising from the fire that had never once gone out. When the first thaw came, it was never sudden, never merciful. It began with a trickle, the faintest murmur of water slipping through cracks in the frozen turf, the sound so small that at first no one believed it. Then one morning, a door that had been half buried in snow opened more easily than before, and a breath of air, not warm exactly, but softer, brushed across the threshold. The storm had loosened its grip, and the long night was finally retreating. Inside the turf house, the light changed. The same narrow openings that had once guarded heat now allowed slender beams of gold to fall across the floor, touching tools left on benches, catching the smoke still drifting lazily from the hearth. The air smelled of thawing soil, wet wool, and faint decay, a scent that to those who had survived meant life. The people emerged slowly, blinking at the white glare of melting snow, their faces pale from months of darkness. Around them the world looked raw and wounded, streaked with mud and ice, but also alive again. Water ran in channels between the hills. Grass pressed through the softening crust. Birds returned, thin and nervous, as if testing whether the land had forgiven them. And now began the labor of renewal, the ritual of maintenance that kept the turf houses alive year after year. The outer walls, softened by meltwater, had to be rebuilt. Men and women walked the slopes with short-handled spades, cutting fresh sods from the hillside, rectangular, firm, the roots still interlaced with living grass. Each block was lifted carefully, its damp weight heavy in the hands, then stacked once more along the old walls, pressed tight into the familiar herringbone pattern, layer by layer, the smell of earth rising around them. Children helped too, their laughter mingling with the grunts of labor, their boots sinking into the thawed ground. To them this was simply what spring meant, not flowers or festivals, but the rebuilding of the home itself, the renewal of the very thing that had kept them alive. The turf house was not an object one built once and forgot. It was a living structure, breathing and aging, demanding care the way a body demands food. In the low morning light, the landscape looked strange. Dozens of green mounds rising from the hillsides, each with smoke curling gently from a hidden vent, each one alive with movement as families repaired walls, cleared the drainage ditches and trimmed the growing grass. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a village of burial mounds awakening after centuries of sleep, but for the Norse who lived here, these were not tombs. They were hearts beating quietly beneath the soil. By midsummer, the transformation was complete. The houses disappeared again into the land, the fresh turf blending seamlessly with the meadow, so that from a distance you could hardly tell where field ended and home began. Sheep grazed over the roofs, wildflowers rooted themselves in the seams between sods, and the people who lived inside walked lightly, knowing that the earth itself had become their shelter, their neighbor, and their memory. Life followed its quiet rhythm. Fishing resumed in the fjords. Fields of barley and hay were tended with care. Women spun yarn on doorsteps when the wind was gentle. Children ran along the slopes chasing gulls, yet every evening, as the sun dipped low over the volcanic plains, the families returned to the same dark entrances, stepping once more into the cool, breathing stillness beneath the turf, where the air was heavy but familiar, where smoke still hung in soft spirals above the hearth, and where warmth once earned never truly left. They did not think of their houses as primitive or strange. To them they were perfect, balanced, enduring, born of the same material that gave rise to grass and life. The walls were alive, growing a little each season, aging but never dying, and in that quiet continuity lay a kind of wisdom that the modern world has mostly forgotten, that the best shelter is not the one that resists the earth, but the one that becomes it. In time, the turf house became more than shelter. It became a universe, a small, ordered cosmos pressed between the cold earth and the endless sky. For those who lived within its thick, breathing walls, the world outside was chaos, wind, sea, snow, darkness. But inside, around the fire, there was meaning. Here, every act carried weight. The lighting of the hearth was not just survival, it was a ceremony. Before dawn, when the coals still glowed faintly red beneath the ash, the oldest woman in the household would stir them carefully with an iron rod, whispering softly, as if speaking to a living thing. The fire was never truly extinguished. To let it die was unthinkable. It was the boundary between life and death, between the world of men and the silent world of the dead, that waited beneath the frozen ground. The Norse understood this instinctively. Long before they built churches, they had already built sanctuaries, dark, earthen halls where warmth was worshipped. Not in words, but in the tending of flame. The hearth stood at the center, not by accident, but by design. Around it the family gathered, ate, slept, and told their stories. Above it, the smoke rose slowly through the vent in the roof, carrying their breath and offerings upward to whatever gods might still be listening through the clouds. When Christianity reached these shores, centuries later, it did not replace this reverence. It absorbed it. The first Icelandic churches were turf houses themselves, low-roofed, humble, warmed by the same fires that had once fed pagan rites. The cross above the doorway might have changed, but the feeling within, the sense of warmth against darkness, remained exactly the same. Archaeologists who dig through the remains of these ancient dwellings sometimes find small altars near the hearth, a flat stone darkened by soot, the faint outline of animal bones burned in offering. To modern eyes, these are traces of superstition, but to those who lived there, they were gestures of gratitude to the earth itself, for holding them through another winter, for lending them walls that breathed and roofs that healed with grass. The orientation of the house, too, carried meaning. Many faced east, toward the first light of day. The front door opened not to a view of the sea or valley, but toward the direction of renewal. Some scholars believe this reflected the Norse idea of balance, light and dark, warmth and cold, life and death, all part of the same endless turning. The turf house was a model of that cycle. It was built from living soil, endured through the season of death, and each spring was renewed again from the same ground. Even the act of sitting around the fire had a rhythm that mirrored the cosmos. The elders closest to the hearth, the children further back, the smoke rising like the world tree itself, connecting the underworld of ash and ember to the heavens through a single narrow vent of light. To live inside a turf house was to live inside a myth, to breathe in the symbols that shaped their understanding of life itself. And through it all, the sound of the fire never ceased. It whispered through centuries, through storms, through births and deaths, through laughter and silence. The flame that warmed their hands also warmed their souls, a constant reminder that even in the farthest reaches of the world, where the night devoured half the year, the light of man could still burn quietly, never grand, never proud, but steady. The turf house did not proclaim its sanctity, it simply embodied it. From the outside it was nothing more than a mound of grass and stone, but to step inside was to enter a space that blurred the line between the human and the divine, a chamber where heat and darkness met, where breath turned to prayer, and where the earth itself became the walls of a sacred heart still beating beneath the snow. Centuries passed and the world around those quiet mounds began to change. Trade routes opened, ships grew larger, and the isolation that had once protected the turf houses slowly eroded. From the south came merchants, tools, and timber, real timber, long and straight, the kind the first settlers had once dreamed of. And with it came the temptation to stand tall again, to build upward instead of inward, to let the house separate from the hill and declare itself a thing apart from the land that had shaped it. In Greenland, where the winters grew longer and the summers shorter, the old Norse colonies began to falter. The sea routes to Norway froze with ice more each year, and the last ships stopped coming. The turf houses there remained, empty, silent, still whole beneath the snow, but their fires went out one by one, until only wind and drifting frost passed through the doorways. The grass continued to grow over them, and in time the mounds merged back into the hills as if they had never been built at all. But in Iceland, the tradition endured. Long after kings rose and fell in Europe, long after stone cathedrals and grand halls filled with light replaced the dim glow of peat fires elsewhere, Icelandic farmers still built with earth and sod. They did so not out of nostalgia, but because the method worked. Even into the 19th century, travellers described entire villages of turf houses, low, mossy, warm and alive. Smoke rose from the roofs like breath, and in winter the world looked again as it had in the sagas, dark and enduring, but never cold inside. Only when the modern world arrived with its machines, its concrete and steel, did the last turf houses begin to fade. Roads were laid, power lines stretched across the plains, and the old earthen homes seemed suddenly too humble, too damp, too quiet for the age of industry. Families moved into square wooden houses with windows and chimneys and rooms that no longer smelled of peat or wool. The turf walls were left to crumble, their grass untrimmed, their roofs collapsing inward, until the houses that had once kept generations alive sank back into the soil they had been carved from. Yet even in decay they refused to vanish completely. The stones of old foundations remained beneath the grass, the outlines of rooms still visible after rain, and when archaeologists unearthed them centuries later, they found not ruins but memories, the warmth of a fire still clinging faintly to the earth, the marks of knives on bone, the prints of bare feet pressed into hardened soil. In the modern age, architects began to rediscover what the Vikings had never forgotten, that the earth itself is the best builder. Designs once dismissed as primitive returned as innovations: green roofs, passive heating, earth-sheltered dwellings, all borrowing quietly from the logic of the turf house. The same principles that once saved lives in the Arctic, insulation through mass, warmth through depth, simplicity through necessity, returned dressed in glass and steel, praised as sustainable, efficient, ecological. But the idea was never new, it was ancient. And so the turf house lives on, not in the form of grass-covered mounds scattered across Iceland, though some still stand carefully preserved, but in the quiet philosophy it left behind, that the land does not need to be conquered, it only needs to be understood. That warmth can come not from fighting nature, but from listening to it. That survival is not triumph, but harmony. When night falls again over the Icelandic plains and the wind begins its old familiar song, it still passes over the buried outlines of those ancient homes. The grass shifts slightly, the soil exhales the faint scent of peat, and if one listens closely, beyond the hum of the storm, it is possible to imagine a faint, steady sound, the whisper of fire beneath the earth, the memory of voices speaking softly in the dark, and the slow, patient heartbeat of a world that once built its shelters out of the very ground that gave it life. If you walk through the Icelandic plains in late winter, when the wind softens and the light returns low and gold, you may still find the remains of those ancient homes, the grass mounded gently over stone, the doorways half buried, the lines of walls faint beneath a skin of moss. From a distance they look like nothing, like the land itself folding in quiet sleep. But when you step closer you can feel it, the weight of time pressing upward through the soil, the faint memory of warmth trapped beneath your boots. The wind moves differently here. It slows, swirls and whispers through the hollows as if unsure whether these mounds are ruins or lungs, still breathing softly under the snow. In the shallows of the light, the contours of old turf roofs reveal themselves for a moment before vanishing again, like ghosts rising briefly from the land that once sustained them. No one lives here now, but the earth remembers. It remembers the steady rhythm of hands cutting sod, the voices of children chasing the last sun of summer, the smell of smoke curling from the vents in the roof. It remembers the patience of those who never asked the land for more than it could give, who shaped their homes from its skin and fed their fires from its heart. Sometimes, farmers still find traces when they plough the ground: an old hearthstone darkened with soot, a bone tool smoothed by touch, a fragment of wood that has somehow resisted 1,000 winters. Each of these things carries not nostalgia, but continuity, proof that life once moved here slowly and deliberately, in tune with the breathing of the earth itself. And far from these ruins, in modern valleys where glass houses and roads now cut through the old soil, a few new builders have begun to listen again. They speak of efficiency, of green design, of insulation and sustainability, but beneath all the language of progress lies the same ancient logic that the Vikings once knew without needing to explain it, that warmth and survival are found not in standing apart from nature, but in settling quietly within it. The wind that crosses these plains has seen everything: ships, storms, machines, and men, but it still carries a trace of smoke when it passes over the old sites, as if some forgotten hearth were still burning below, steady and hidden. And perhaps, in a way it is. The houses are gone, the families dispersed, yet the idea, the quiet understanding that the ground beneath your feet can be both enemy and ally, still lingers in the air like an ember refusing to fade. The story doesn't end here. The land still breathes. And somewhere ahead, beyond the ridge or the next page, another door waits, a door half sunk into the hill, its frame darkened by soot, its threshold soft with moss. Someone will open it again one day and step inside, and the warmth will still be there, waiting patiently like a memory that never forgot the sound of human breath. By the middle of the 19th century, when the rest of Europe had already filled its cities with iron bridges and gas lamps, Iceland still looked much the same as it had 1,000 years before. The sea was the only road, the horse the only engine, and on the windswept plains the same low turf houses still rose from the ground, green in summer, white in winter, silent through the endless wind. Travellers who arrived from abroad often wrote of them with astonishment. They had expected huts or shacks, crude shelters on the edge of the Arctic, but what they found were labyrinths, complex networks of low, sod-roofed rooms connected by narrow passages, dim and warm, each space thick with the smell of peat smoke, wool, tallow, and earth. Some called them primitive, others called them perfect. From the outside, the houses seemed to melt into the land. A visitor could ride straight past a farmstead without realizing it was there. Only a dark door cut into a mound betrayed the entrance, sometimes framed with driftwood, sometimes with stone, and above it, grass growing wild with buttercups and clover. Chickens pecked on the roof. Sheep grazed along the ridge. The home and the pasture were the same living thing. Inside, the light was soft and golden, filtered through oiled parchment or a tiny pane of imported glass. The floors were packed earth, smooth and firm from generations of footsteps. The walls, though made of turf, felt solid to the touch, warm, breathing faintly, holding in the scent of decades. Smoke drifted in slow ribbons from the hearth, curling through the air like threads of memory. The family gathered close in the main room, the bathers' they called it. Here they worked, ate, slept, and prayed. The benches along the walls were covered with sheepskin, serving as both beds and seats. At one end of the room stood a small table and a spinning wheel. At the other, a cradle and a chest filled with wool. Every inch of the space carried purpose. Nothing was decorative. Everything had to earn its right to exist. During winter, when storms blocked the door for days, the bathstoffer became the entire world. Children learned their letters by firelight, tracing words into the soot on the walls. Mothers spun yarn with fingers cracked from cold. Men mended nets, shaped tools, or told stories so old that even they had forgotten who first spoke them. The rhythm of speech was slow, steady, like the breathing of the house itself. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, time pulled softly in the corners. There was a kind of comfort in this confinement, a strange intimacy born of necessity. The walls, thick with turf, muted the violence of the world. Every gust of wind became a dull sigh. Every drop of melting snow sounded like a heartbeat against the roof. In that enclosed stillness, the people learned to listen to the earth shifting, to the fire whispering, to each other breathing in the dark. And yet change was coming. Across the sea, ships carried lumber, iron stoves, Windows of real glass. New ideas of progress arrived with missionaries and traders. The turf houses, once symbols of endurance, began to seem like remnants of a poorer age. To some, they were shameful reminders of isolation, of a life too close to the mud. To others, they were sacred, the last link to ancestors who had carved survival out of the ground itself. So for a time, two worlds coexisted. Along the coast, in small harbours like Reykjavik, new timber houses began to rise, square, straight and painted in bright colours that startled the grey landscape. But inland, on the windswept farms where no ship could bring wood cheaply, the old way endured. The peat was still cut in spring, the walls were still rebuilt each summer, the earth still rose to cradle those who belonged to it. And when winter came again, long and relentless, those who lived in the turf houses would sit quietly in the batherstofa and listen to the storm outside. They would feel the earth pressing close, warm and patient, and they would know what their ancestors had always known, that survival was not a matter of progress or pride, but of belonging. By the early 20th century, the old turf houses were fading into memory. Steamships came and went from Reykjavik now, bringing timber from Norway, glass from Copenhagen, and the hum of a world that no longer needed to hide beneath the soil. The air in the small harbours smelled of salt and coal instead of peat and wool, and for the first time in 1,000 years, homes began to reach upward again, squaring their shoulders against the wind, as if to declare that Iceland, too, was stepping into the modern age. But in the high valleys and northern fjords, far from the sound of machinery, the past persisted. Families still lived under sod roofs, still tended fires that had never gone out. The turf walls, thick with moss and roots, were patched each spring as they had always been. The same doors creaked on driftwood hinges. The same faint smell of smoke clung to the rafters. Generations had come and gone, yet the rhythm of life remained exactly as it had been when the first settlers built their homes from the land itself. Photographs from that time, sepia, grainy and quiet, show faces that seem both ancient and modern. Women in wool shawls stand at the entrances of grassy mounds, their hair tied back, their eyes steady and unbothered. Children play among the sheep grazing on the roof, unaware that they are living within history's final breath. Inside, old men sit beside the same hearths their ancestors had tended, their hands wrapped around cups of sour milk or coffee, their voices rising softly in the flicker of the fire. When strangers came to visit, artists, scholars, travellers, they often remarked on the warmth, not the emotional kind, but the physical one, deep and constant. They would step through the low doorway expecting damp and cold, but instead find stillness and heat, air thick with the scent of burning turf and fermented hay. The turf house defied its appearance. It looked like earth, but it breathed like flesh. By the 1930s, though, progress could no longer be delayed. The government encouraged new building methods, wood, stone, eventually concrete. Turf was called backward, unclean, too much work for too little comfort. And so, one by one, the old houses were abandoned. Some were left to collapse under their own weight. Others were carefully dismantled, their wood reused in newer homes. A few were kept alive a little longer, museum pieces in living villages where the old farmers refused to move. In those last decades, you could still find a handful of glowing windows beneath the snow far inland, where families who wanted nothing from the modern world still lived by firelight. They rose with the wind, mended their roofs when the frost retreated, whispered old prayers before sleep, and let their lives pass in the same rhythm that had guided the Norse 1,000 years before. When those fires finally went out, they didn't go dark with tragedy. They faded like embers cooling after a long vigil. The earth took them back slowly, tenderly without a sound. The walls softened, the roofs sank, the doorways filled with grass, until only the shape remained, a curved outline where once there had been breath and song and laughter. Yet Iceland did not forget. Even as concrete and steel replaced peat and sod, the people remembered. They built museums not as monuments but as promises, reconstructed turf houses set gently into the hills, their fires lit for visitors, their air still heavy with smoke. Inside them, time seems to stop. You can walk through a doorway and feel the warmth of 1,000 winters held within the walls, the whisper of lives that once endured, not by conquering the cold, but by understanding it. And in that moment, standing in the dim light of a peat hearth, you begin to sense what they must have known, that the earth never truly lets go of those who listen to it, that every breath of warm air in that space is borrowed from centuries past, and that somewhere beyond the walls, beneath the grass still stirred by the wind, the old houses are waiting, patient, unbroken, and alive. In the new century, when cities began to rise higher and shine brighter than the stars they obscured, a quiet countercurrent began to stir, an unease, a longing for silence, a memory half buried in the soil. People who had grown up surrounded by glass and concrete started to look again toward the ground beneath their feet, to wonder whether the future had perhaps been built too far from the earth that once gave them shelter. And when they searched for answers, some of them looked north to the old turf houses of Iceland, half forgotten but never gone. Modern architects spoke of sustainability, of green roofs and thermal mass and passive heating, but behind the technical language was something older, more instinctive. They had rediscovered what the Vikings had once known without calculation, that warmth can be stored in the body of the earth itself, that the best insulation is silence, and that true comfort comes not from dominating nature, but from folding yourself quietly into its rhythms. Across northern Europe, small studios began to experiment again with sod and clay, shaping homes that disappeared into hillsides, buildings that breathed with the seasons, roofs that bloomed in summer and froze in winter, exactly as they had 1,000 years before. Some looked like the old turf halls reborn, low green, barely visible from afar. Others took the idea and translated it into the language of the present. Glass-fronted dwellings buried in the side of volcanic slopes, houses whose walls were not barriers but continuations of the mountain itself. In Iceland, a handful of families still live in restored turf houses, not as reenactment, but as conviction. They speak of the quiet as something holy, of how the thick earth walls hold back every sound of the storm until the world feels smaller, more intimate, more alive. They describe the smell of turf smoke not as nostalgia, but as truth, the scent of a life paced by fire, breath, and patience. Visitors who step into these preserved homes often fall silent. The transition from modern air to that old, dense stillness feels almost sacred. The temperature drops, yet it does not chill. The dimness is deep, but not dark. And in that silence, surrounded by living walls and breathing earth, something ancient stirs a recognition, soft and wordless, that humanity's oldest technology was not the tool or the wheel, but the hearth. Scientists studying energy efficiency write papers about thermal mass and energy exchange. Designers sketch eco-homes inspired by the curves of the landscape. Yet what they are all reaching toward, whether they know it or not, is what the Vikings built with bare hands and instinct: equilibrium. The delicate harmony between shelter and soil, between warmth and endurance, between the human pulse and the steady breath of the planet. The past, it turns out, was never truly buried. It simply waited. Beneath moss, beneath memory, beneath centuries of progress, for us to be quiet enough to hear it again. And when we listen now, when we trace the old patterns in the turf and the stone, we do not just find the remains of ancient houses, we find blueprints for a future that has forgotten how to belong. Somewhere in the Icelandic countryside, on a calm evening when the sun never fully sets and the grass glows gold across the hills, a single preserved turf house still exhales its faint warmth into the cooling air. Inside, the fire burns softly. The walls breathe, and if you stand there long enough, if you listen closely, you might hear it again. The slow murmur of the old wisdom, the one that whispers through time and wind alike. Build with the earth, not against it. Live quietly, and you will endure. There is something haunting about the way the earth remembers us. It holds the shape of what we build, the warmth of where we sleep, the ashes of what we burn. Every mark we leave upon it eventually softens, but it never quite disappears. It becomes part of the soil's quiet memory, folded layer upon layer, like breath pressed into time. The old turf houses are gone now, most of them, yet their outlines linger, faint as veins beneath skin. Grass grows where the walls once stood, roots binding themselves to the same places where human hands once stacked sods in careful patterns. The distinction between structure and landscape has vanished. Only continuity remains. What was built by man has returned to the rhythm of rain and thaw, of frost and melt, of silence and sound. But perhaps that was always their purpose. The Vikings did not build these homes to last forever. They built them to live within the cycle. Their walls were meant to decay, their roofs to sink, their doors to fade beneath the grass. The beauty of the turf house was not permanence. It was participation. It belonged to time rather than defying it. And in that humility lies a truth our age still struggles to remember, that endurance is not about resisting the elements, but about becoming one with them. When we walk among their remains, we walk among echoes. The air is thick with memory, smoke that no longer rises, warmth that no longer burns, yet still exists in the soil like a faint pulse. Sometimes, when the wind moves just right, you can almost imagine the sound of laughter, the scrape of a wooden bowl, the hiss of peat catching flame. The earth keeps these fragments close, guarding them with the patience only nature understands. In a way, we are all made of the same memory. Our bones carry the minerals of the soil. Our blood holds traces of ancient rain. The warmth we seek when the world turns cold is the same warmth our ancestors kindled beneath the ground. We have changed the shape of our shelters, but not the longing that builds them. We still crave walls that hold us gently, air that remembers our breath, silence that does not feel empty but alive. Perhaps that is why the sight of a turf house stirs something deep and wordless within us. It is not nostalgia, it is recognition, a quiet knowing that this too was us, that once we lived closer to the heart of things, where the wind spoke softly through the grass and every stone had a place in the circle of life and death and life again. And even now, as we cover the earth with steel and glass, we remain tethered to that memory. It lingers in our need for warmth, for belonging, for stillness. It waits in the soil beneath our cities, in the hum of our walls, in the faint vibration of the world itself. The earth is still building, still remembering, still breathing us in and out. And somewhere far north, where the nights are long and the wind carries voices older than speech, a door of sod still stands in the side of a hill. It opens inward, not outward, because the way home has always been through the heart of the earth. Some say the earth forgets us, that it swallows our traces and smooths them away, but that is not true. The earth does not forget. It dreams. And in its long, slow dreaming, it remembers every fire ever lit, every footprint ever pressed into the mud, every voice that once whispered beneath the snow. The turf houses are part of that dream now. They lie beneath the hills like sleeping animals, their walls softened by centuries, their doors sealed, their fires long cold. Yet when the wind passes over them, the land exhales a low hum, a tone too deep for words, the sound of memory itself turning in its sleep. At night, when the northern lights ripple across the sky like green water, they seem to flow down into the soil, slipping through the cracks of the old roofs, bathing the buried rooms in ghostly colour. The Vikings once believed that the aurora was the reflection of armour, the shimmer of spirits travelling to Valhalla. But maybe it is the earth remembering them instead, relighting the fires they left behind. In those moments, the boundaries blur, the living and the dead, the past and the present, the soil and the soul. They all drift closer, circling one another like smoke above a sleeping hearth. The turf house becomes not a ruin, but a symbol of return, of rest, of the long breath between worlds. Beneath every mound there is silence, but it is not an empty one. It is full of patience, of warmth, of the faint heartbeat of everything that has ever lived. The same heartbeat that pulses through the roots of grass, through rivers beneath ice, through the chest of a man lying awake in winter listening to the wind and thinking of home. Because the truth is, the Vikings never really left their houses. They only sank deeper into the soil they trusted, into the warmth they had built, into the dream that still hums beneath Iceland's frozen fields. And when you walk there now, when you place your hand on the ground and feel the faint vibration beneath your fingers, you are not touching ruins. You are touching sleep. The kind of sleep that waits, not the kind that ends. And maybe one day, when the world grows loud enough to forget its own heartbeat, the earth will open its eyes again, the doors of sod will lift, the fires will breathe, and once more men and women will walk into the hills, dig deep and listen, to build not from ambition but from memory, to build not against the wind, but with it. And in that moment, under a sky without edges, the circle will close, the grass will rise, the warmth will return, and the dream will begin again, exactly where it left off, quietly beneath the earth. So close your eyes for a moment, and imagine it, the land rolling outward in every direction, quiet, endless, the wind carrying nothing but its own soft echo. Somewhere in that silence, beneath a hill that looks like all the others, a small door waits, half hidden under grass. It opens easily, as if it has been expecting you. You step inside. The air is cool and still, filled with the scent of soil and faint smoke. The walls curve around you, not like walls at all, but like the inside of a heartbeat, alive and patient. The ceiling dips low, the fire crackles in the corner, and for a long moment you do nothing. You simply breathe. The world outside feels far away now. The snow, the noise, the weight of everything that demanded your strength, all of it fades into the hum of the earth beneath your feet. You can hear it if you listen. The slow rhythm of warmth moving through turf, through ash, through stone, through time. The house does not care who you are, or when you came. It only knows that you are cold, and it answers in the only language it has ever spoken. It gives you heat. It gives you silence. It gives you rest. This was always the secret of the Vikings. Not their weapons or their ships, but their understanding that the world itself could become home if you learned how to listen. They did not build to impress the gods. They built to survive the night. And in that survival they found something sacred, something that still lives here, in this room, in the walls that breathe, in the glow that trembles on your skin. The fire flickers. You feel its warmth on your face. Outside, the wind drags its fingers across the roof, but it cannot reach you. The house has swallowed the storm as it always has, turning chaos into calm, noise into heartbeat, fear into sleep. And as you sit there, eyes half closed, you begin to feel it that you too are part of the same pattern. You too are made of soil and breath and memory. The same warmth that once burned in a Viking hearth now lingers somewhere behind your ribs. The same silence that filled those earthen halls now settles behind your eyelids. The story has no ending, because the house is still here, waiting beneath the grass, patient as time. It has always been here. It always will be. So let the fire dim. Let the wind fade. Let the earth breathe you in and hold you and keep you safe through the long northern night. The wind was quiet now, its long journey across the plains ending in a soft sigh that passed over the hills like a memory. And beneath those same hills, buried under layers of grass and time, the last turf houses still breathed faintly, their walls damp and dark but alive in some small, unexplainable way, as if the earth itself refused to forget the warmth that had once been kindled there. The snow had settled into smooth white folds, muffling the sound of everything that lived above, and from within the mounds came only stillness, the kind of stillness that was not absence but presence, the patient silence of something eternal. Inside one such hill, in a hollow that had not seen sunlight for centuries, the remains of a hearth still glowed faintly, the ash cold to the touch, yet stained with the memory of flame. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear it, the soft, uneven rhythm of heat moving through the turf, of life pressed into soil, of the house itself exhaling slowly, as though the centuries were nothing more than a single long night. Above, the sky turned in silence, the aurora spreading its green and silver light over the land, like water flowing in slow motion, spilling across the frozen plains and washing softly over the buried roofs, illuminating for a heartbeat the shape of doors that no longer opened, windows that no longer shone, and yet, somewhere deep within, warmth that had not died. The world, it seemed, had grown louder, faster, brighter, but the earth had not changed its pace. It still dreamed at the same speed as stone, as root as fire cooling in the dark. There was something endless about that patience, something that felt like forgiveness, as if the land, having watched us build and burn and build again, had decided to remember only the moments when we rested, when we listened, when we tended, when we became part of its breathing. The turf houses were gone, yet they continued to exist in another form, not as ruins but as echoes, as warmth buried in the subconscious of the world, waiting for those who had forgotten how to be quiet to remember what silence feels like. Inside that silence, everything was slower. The sound of the wind against the roof was a heartbeat. The faint crackle of a fire was a kind of prayer. The scent of smoke was not decay but continuation. The same scent that had clung to the clothes of those who slept here long ago, the same warmth that had softened their bones through countless winters. To sit there, even only in memory, was to feel the boundary between the living and the land dissolve, to realize that the difference between the two had always been smaller than we imagined. And so the fire, though invisible, still burned deep under the grass, beneath the frost and the roots, beneath centuries of snow. It was no longer a flame but a pulse, a soft throb in the dark, the heartbeat of a world that had never truly stopped dreaming of warmth. The land remembered, the house endured, the story continued in the soil, and for a moment, if you stood there in the fading light, breathing in the cold air heavy with the scent of peat and thyme, you could almost feel it, the faint echo of human breath mingling with the slow exhalation of the earth itself, one long, endless rhythm that said without words, "Rest now, you are home." The wind has gone quiet now, drifting slowly across the dark horizon like something that has finally grown tired of moving. And beneath the sleeping hills the earth holds its breath, remembering the warmth that once lived inside it, remembering the sound of footsteps that no longer fall, the smell of peat smoke that once curled against the roof, the gentle rise and fall of voices speaking softly in the language of survival. The snow lies heavy over everything, smooth and white, as if the whole world has been tucked beneath a single blanket. And under that weight the old turf houses still rest, their walls damp and blackened with age but still strong, still breathing faintly, their foundations pulsing with a kind of hidden life that has outlasted every storm. Inside one of them, if you could walk quietly enough, you would find the hearth still there, a shallow ring of stone set into the floor, the ash long cold yet marked by the memory of flame. It would not take much to imagine that the warmth remains buried deep in the walls, folded into the layers of sod, waiting patiently in the silence. Above, the sky drifts with slow ribbons of green light, the aurora spreading like water through the stars, spilling across the frozen plains until it meets the roof of the earth, and slides down the curve of the land, filling every hollow with its soft reflection. For an instant the world seems awake, every buried room lit again from within, every forgotten doorway breathing once more. There is no sound except the whisper of the wind brushing against the grass, no movement except the slow shifting of snow as it settles against the contours of the hill, and in that stillness the earth feels vast and alive, its silence not empty but full, full of all the stories that were ever spoken here, full of the warmth that still hums faintly below the surface, full of the slow patience of time itself. It is in this silence that you begin to understand that nothing ever truly ends, that warmth does not vanish, that the memory of fire lingers in the ground long after the flames have gone. If you stand there long enough, your breath will start to match the rhythm of the wind. The sound of your heartbeat will blend with the faint pulse beneath your feet. The air, heavy with the scent of peat and frost, will wrap itself around you like the walls of an invisible home. The line between your body and the land will blur until you are no longer separate from it, until you realize that this deep and endless quiet is what it has always meant to belong somewhere. The house beneath the hill no longer has a door, yet you can still feel it waiting. The hearth no longer burns, yet the heat is still there, hidden in the memory of the soil. The people who once lived here are gone, yet their breath is still caught between the roots of the grass, whispering softly as the wind moves over them. And as you listen, eyes half closed, the rhythm of the world slows until it feels like sleep itself, a long, dreamless sleep in which the earth does not forget but remembers, in which every ember cools but never dies, in which every heartbeat folds gently back into the soil that gave it life. And in that slow, endless breath between silence and warmth, you understand what they knew when they built their homes beneath the grass. That safety was never in stone or wood or strength, but in stillness. That warmth was not given, but made. That home was not a place above the ground, but beneath it, where the world still remembers how to hold you. The fire has faded to a glow now, but it is enough. The wind has softened to a sigh, and it is enough. The earth breathes once more, slow and deep, and it is enough. Somewhere under the hill, in the oldest part of the night, the story continues. Not in words, but in the faint, steady pulse of warmth, moving through the dark, a quiet promise that even here, even now, the house still lives, and the earth still remembers you. The wind has finally gone quiet, its long voice fading across the empty plains where nothing moves except the slow drift of snow. And beneath that vast silence the land seems to breathe, drawing in air so cold that it crackles before settling again into stillness. A stillness so deep it feels alive. Under one of the hills, hidden by grass and centuries, there is still a house, half buried and half forgotten, its roof sunken into the earth, its walls damp with age, its hearth long cold but not entirely dead, because somewhere deep within the soil there is warmth that does not fade, the echo of fires that once burned here, the faintest trace of life that the world has not been able to erase. Inside that house, the air is heavy and slow, filled with the scent of peat and ash and old smoke, the kind of air that has learned how to keep secrets, the kind that clings to memory long after it should have vanished. The light that filters in through the cracks is weak and grey, the sky outside a pale curtain of drifting snow, and yet within this buried quiet there is a softness that feels like peace, as though the earth itself has pulled the house back into its body, cradling it gently, keeping it safe from the endless wind above. If you could step inside, you would feel that warmth still lingering in the walls, a kind of breath that moves slowly through the sod, pulsing softly through the dark, a reminder that what was once alive does not truly disappear, it only changes its shape. The earth holds every trace, the ashes of old fires, the faint marks of tools, the worn stones where people once sat and spoke and dreamed. The air would hum with memory, not loud enough to hear, but enough to feel in your bones, a rhythm as slow as a heartbeat, as patient as the turning of seasons. Outside, the northern lights move silently across the sky, their colors sliding like water over the frozen land, and for a brief moment, the buried hills glow faintly, as if the light is seeping through the ground itself, waking the old houses beneath, reminding them of the warmth they once contained. Nothing here feels dead, only resting. The earth does not bury to forget, it buries to remember. Every mound, every hollow, every dark line beneath the snow is a fragment of the same endless story, the one that began when people first learned that the ground beneath their feet could be both shelter and soul. Their houses are gone, their fires extinguished, but the warmth remains in the soil, the silence filled with the sound of breath that is not yours but still feels familiar. And as you stand there, feeling the cold air slide past your skin, something inside you begins to slow, your pulse matching the rhythm of the land, your breathing falling into time with the invisible heartbeat of the earth. The line between your body and the soil fades, and for a moment you understand that there is no difference, that you are made of the same elements, that the warmth you carry and the warmth that sleeps beneath the ground are one and the same. The night deepens, the sky turns darker, the fire in the heart of the world sinks lower but never disappears, and beneath the endless snow the old house continues to breathe, slow and steady, wrapped in silence and patience, keeping its promise to hold whatever warmth remains. The wind sighs, the grass bends, the world exhales, and somewhere under the hill the fire still breathes, quiet and eternal, waiting not to be seen but simply to be felt. And now, as the wind drifts away and the world folds itself into darkness, you can feel the air changing around you, slower, heavier, calmer, as though the night itself were drawing closer, just to listen to your breathing. Somewhere beyond the window, the snow is falling without sound, each flake settling into the next, until the ground becomes one smooth sheet of white, and beneath it all, the earth lies awake, holding the warmth of 1,000 winters deep inside its chest. You can almost hear it if you stop thinking for a moment. The faint hum beneath your feet, the slow rhythm of heat and memory moving through soil and stone, the same pulse that has kept life alive since the beginning. This is what the Vikings felt when they sat beside their hearths, when the wind screamed outside and the walls trembled, when the world beyond the door was dark and endless, but the world inside the earth was small and kind and warm. They learned what it meant to be safe, not by closing themselves off from the land, but by sinking deeper into it, by breathing with it, by letting the fire and the soil and their own hearts beat in the same rhythm, until they no longer knew where one ended and the other began. You can feel that same stillness now, that same warmth, that same quiet invitation to rest, the sense that the earth has opened a space for you, not out of pity or mercy, but because it remembers that you too belong here. You do not need to fight the cold or the noise or the endless turning of the world outside. The warmth you need has always been here, waiting patiently, folded into the deep silence of the land. Close your eyes and let the air grow thick and soft around you. Imagine the walls breathing, the earth wrapping itself around you the way it once wrapped around those ancient houses beneath the grass. There is no fear here, no hurry, only the slow exhalation of time, the whisper of snow settling against the roof, the sound of your own breath blending with the old breath of the world. And as you drift towards sleep, remember that nothing truly ends. Not the warmth, not the story, not the fire. It only sinks lower, resting beneath the surface, glowing quietly, waiting for you to return. The earth holds it for you, patient and unchanging, the way it has held every ember, every memory, every heartbeat that ever sought its shelter. Let it hold you now. Let the silence draw closer. Let the weight of the night press down softly, until all that remains is warmth and breath, and the slow pulse of the world beneath you, steady and endless and kind. And somewhere far away, under the hill, the last fire still breathes, waiting for you to dream your way back to it.